Welcome to Prospects to Pros, the show where we talk about the college football players who are about to be NFL players, the NFL players who were just college football players, and everything in between. I'm Andy Staples. I'm here with Dane Brugler, the athletics draft guru, and very special guest, the king of the freaks list. He's actually a freak himself, if you've ever seen him do pull-ups. Bruce Feldman from The Athletic. Hey, Bruce.
Oh, good to be on with two of my favorite people, two of my favorite coworkers. So I'm excited about this. I always love this kind of nerd space that we're in, that we're all kind of, I don't know, a little too giddy about.
We're going to be really nerdy, and I'm so excited. I was texting with Dane the other day, and so there was one prospect in his top 50 that I meant to ask him about last week, and I didn't really get a chance to. And then I watched the game that you were at this weekend, the Texas Tech TCU game. And I'm like, oh my God, Tyree Wilson from Texas Tech. He's the edge rusher. He's 6'6", 270. He almost single-handedly ended TCU's undefeated season. Like if Texas Tech's offense had been able to do anything in the second half, Tyree Wilson may have changed the whole story of the Big 12 this year. What did you see in person from this guy?
Yeah, I mean, so fortunately, I'm able to be out on the field a couple hours before game time. Sometimes you see the guys warming up. You see them who are, not in pads. And he A+'s the eye test for sure. When you see him, he looks different. I mean, he's, really long arms, really, he's not 6'3.5" or whatever. The other thing that kind of I thought of when I saw it, I was like, man, this guy could probably carry 295 pounds pretty easily. He's like lean. He looks a little like a power forward, not like a legit NBA, like a big power forward, right? Kind of thing. I talked to Tim DeRuiter, who's the defensive coordinator for Tech. And he was just at Oregon. So he had Kayvon Thibodeau and he had some guys. I mean, DJ Johnson is another one. I'm curious what you guys think of too, different kinds of players. But, he was like, yeah, there's a lot of stuff you can do with him. He was very effusive in how he talked about him. I think personality wise, he's probably a little different than Kayvon too. But he was impressive, not just impressive, like watching him move around in the pregame and what kind of frame he has. But then certainly, as you guys saw, there's some wow plays he puts on film. And I'm curious to see how he gets used because so much of, I'm running into a lot of personnel people before games. And there are certain players and even players that maybe I'm asking them about who aren't at my game. Kalijah Cansey is definitely one where it's like, oh, it's going to be interesting to see how, like what kind of system he goes into or how they use them. And I feel like so much of that is like, especially with D linemen, it's like, okay, what kind of system are you going into? How are they going to use them? Where the value is? But he's really interesting player.
Well, I think that's part of what makes him so appealing is because, like you said, he can fit a lot of different systems. I mean, they run a lot of 3-man odd fronts at Tech, and it doesn't matter if he's head up over the tackle, on the inside shoulder. He has that power to go right through him. He's shocking his hands. I wouldn't call him necessarily refined or crafty as a pass rusher, but he'll use different moves. You see a swipe rip, you see a cross rip that's pretty effective, and so he's so long, and that you see those long strides too. So he's faster than you think. He'll chase down players from the backside, which is really impressive to see. And so right now, he is second in all of college football, just ahead of Will Anderson in total pressures this year with 47. So this is a guy that has the traits, looks the part, plays the part, still has growth potential, like you mentioned, Bruce, and the production is showing up. Even though he doesn't get a lot of pin your ears back, beat the tackle one-on-one, he still finds ways to get to the backfield and affect what they're doing.
Yeah, and I think the difference, and this is not a slight on Will Anderson, but, he is the guy who everybody knows about now, right?
Yeah.
On that defense. So, you're going to get all the focus of what they're doing. And I think that's interesting to see how he can still be productive because sometimes you'll see a guy and they will put up huge numbers as a sophomore. And you're expecting like the TFLs to go crazy again because they just did, and the player's probably better, but the other team is probably more mindful of him. And to see him still be that kind of impact guy at the point and do some of the things he can do, really interesting player. I'd be curious, like who is the 4-eye you see in college football right now is like, is there a separate ranking of those guys, and where does he fit in that? Because I mean, man, there's a lot probably NFL D-line coaches would be excited about with him.
There's no doubt. And Texas Tech, not known for defense, obviously, but I looked it up. They've never had a top 20 pick on defense. Offense, Mahomes, Crabtree, they've had high picks, but on defense, they've never had a top 20 pick. This guy's got a chance to be their first one. He came in at number 12 on my top 50 list. A pretty impressive player.
Yeah, I remember back, this is before you guys, I think it was Gabe Rivera. He was I think he was a first round pick of the Steelers, but then had a horrific car accident, never played. And then just a few years ago, they had Jordan Brooks.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. That he was the 27th overall pick to the Seahawks. Yeah,
Rivero's 21, so that's why I said top 20. Yeah, good.
It's crazy. I mean, it's crazy, but not. Yes, yeah.
So it is interesting because this is a different position, and like people say defensive end, and you got to remember that defensive end means a couple of different things. If you're a defensive end in an even front, that's your classic edge rusher, 6'5", 260 pounds, really fast, Javon Curse, that type of person.
The state of Florida was like back when, maybe a little past you, Andy, but Florida State
had Renard Wilson and Andre Wadsworth, and
David Warren was coming up, and Roland Seymour, and they had guys like that. Probably like, honestly, Brian Burns, like a precursor to Brian Burns.
Yes, yeah, or Jermaine Johnson, even I think is kind of that guy. Even though he didn't really play, he didn't play that role at Georgia. He played it at Florida State. But what we're talking about is an even front defensive end. So this is a person who plays 4-eye, which is inside eye of the tackle, or 5 technique, which is head up on the tackle on the other side. And you got to be bigger. Like in the NFL, you need to be 285, 290 to play this position effectively. I think it's a really different skill set. And that's what, watching Tyree Wilson, I was like, good Lord, because he looks like the Kayvon Thibodeau, even front type guy, but he could be very disruptive coming through the middle of the offensive line rather than coming around the edge.
Yeah, I think there's been some interesting prospects who've come through either Houston. We've seen Peyton Turner. I'm trying to remember who was our guy last year, who was probably rawer, but maybe more explosive.
Logan Hall. Jeez.
Logan Hall. Yeah, like there are guys like that who, I'm not saying this is Marcus Davenport. There are guys who did not go to Texas or Texas A&M who are really interesting, like D-line guys who have kind of developed or blossomed. And I think it's like, okay, what's the next step in their development, along the lines like that? Because I definitely think we've seen some of them.
Yeah, it is going to be fun to see where Wilson ends up getting picked, because it's a need specific thing too. It's going to be a team that's you run a primarily odd front defense. Now, I do think if he can really hold 290, that offers some positional versatility where if you want to do some even front looks, you could even put him at 3 technique. Sure. And then you have some rush up the middle that would be pretty nasty. So especially on a passing down. So I am excited to see what he does. But Bruce, because of your job with Fox and getting to go to the big noon Saturday games, you've gotten to see Michigan a ton this week. I have some questions about several different Michigan guys, because Mazi Smith was number 1 on your freaks list. And if you want to regale us with some of those testing numbers, by all means do. But then I want to get your take on what you've seen from him in person on the field this year, and does it back it up?
Yeah, I mean, he is super explosive and powerful. And when you watch him, there's some times where you see, and the most dominant D lineman I've seen, as a sideline reporter, and this is like basically a 6 or 7 year window. It's not a 20-year window, but Vita Vea was just throwing 300 pounders around like he was throwing stew around. Just like it was incredible to watch what he did in the Athletic.
That would be Stuart Mandel, our coworker at the Athletic, who is not 300 pounds.
No, and probably has like 23-inch arms. But this is like just insane to see what he was doing. And Washington State had pretty big alignment. And so when you watch Mazi, what's different it's not fair to compare. Like Vita Vea is much longer. Mazi is, I think, is somewhere in the middle of that and Daron Payne, who just incredibly strong and powerful, moves well. He's disruptive. I think he plays, everything I've heard inside the program has been, they love his leadership. They love what he brings. I think he really sets the tempo up front. Again, he's another guy where it's like, okay, what kind of system do you run? I know he's in Dane's top 50. I don't know if you're that kind of guy. Does somebody take you in the top 20, no matter what you do at the combine, right? And this guy, I think, will vertical jump in the mid 30s at 335. He made vertical jump 35 inches.
Crazy.
His shuttle time is going to be crazy. He may bench 2.25, 45 times. He's just a remarkable athlete, and he's got the intangibles. So I think he's really interesting. You see other guys around him, who have emerged as really good players in the D line. Like after Aiden Hutchinson moved on, they're not as good as him, but there are other guys who have really raised their game. And I think he's a big part of that. And so it's a really interesting program. I think your number 5 guy, Dane, is a Olu in the Big Ten, who's really impressive when you see him. Their Olu is much older. I think he's probably 4 years older, but came from is the center and he transferred from Virginia.
This is Oluwatimi, who might be the best pickup out of the transfer portal this year, other than maybe Jahmyr Gibbs
or Jaden.
I feel like okay. Yeah, okay. Jaden Daniels is okay. All right, that's fine. That's fair.
But he is really, really good, right? This was a great offensive line last year. I think it might be an even better offensive line. Like the thing that Andy asked me about seeing Michigan, so we've had them 4 times in person. They are really physical. I don't know where the other offensive linemen they have get drafted when they come out. The Zach Zinners are, I think these guys are all going to play in the NFL. I don't know how high up, their Olu, I think, is really good. I don't know where, where a center goes. We saw that last year with a great one, albeit a shorter, smaller one, from Iowa, who as we're taping this, I watched the Monday night game last night. He's doing really well in Baltimore, but really good player. And the things that I think are different about this Michigan team than last year, they're much deeper at receiver. Ronnie Bell's back. They have a lot of speed. You see Donovan Edwards, I think, is actually underrated because he's so versatile and they do so much and he's really dynamic. I think Blake Corum is a really good running back in terms of just he's just really quick in and out of the hole. He's powerful. You see him in person. He's like a fire hydrant. It's a really interesting team because I think they don't get enough credit for how athletic they are, because they are being measured against Ohio State, and Ohio State probably had more, has more 5 stars where Michigan has a lot of 4 stars. But I think because of the way they practice, because of the way they have developed players, there's a lot of really good football players on this team at different stages of their development. And so when I see Mazi is grown man. He's like the alpha of the place. But then there's other guys who are not far from that. And I think you got a really interesting mix there.
Well, and with Mazi, I mean, you meant the numbers are crazy, but one thing I really appreciate with him is the athletic endurance. I mean, he doesn't come off the field. He's averaging 42 snaps, defensive snaps per game. And I think that's something that goes overlooked. Like Jordan Davis last year was a first-round pick. He is a freak, but he averaged about 22 snaps for Georgia last year. And now for the Eagles, he's only playing kind of the same number of snaps. He's not playing these high volume snaps. Now, when he's on the field, he's just dominant. But because he doesn't play a high number of snaps, that was my one concern with Jordan Davis. With Mazi Smith, now he's not the same size or type of player as Jordan Davis, but I think to stay on the field like that and not have to worry, we got to get this guy off the field, it's a passing down or whatever. That's something that will certainly help him come draft time when teams are breaking these guys down and say, okay, we could use a nose, we could use a one technique. This is what this guy brings to the table. It's not just these freaky numbers. It's definitely showing up, and like you said, it's helping Mike Morris on the edge. It's helping that transfer. They got number 18, Anoma, who's
Eyabi Okie, Eyabi Anoma before.
Yeah. That guy, I mean, the characters, we'll have to figure that part out. But just talking on the field, so explosive. I mean, that guy was, and he joined the team in August, right?
Yeah. Yeah. He joined the team in August. And it's interesting, like as we're taping this, I have a big story that I worked on basically about the guy who kind of created the culture there and helped Jim Harbaugh's right-hand man, Biff Poggi. And he was an extremely successful high school coach in Baltimore. And he had Blake Corum. He had 4 kids who are on this Michigan team now. And Eyabi was one of those kids. And Biff's a huge reason why he ended up transferring, because he started out as a 5-star, was at Alabama, played some, maturity was kind of all over the place a little bit with him. Went to Houston. It did not go well there. Did not fit. Transferred to Tennessee. Martin played and was a solid player, ended up graduating, and then ended up getting to Michigan as a grad transfer right before, right as training camp was going. And so his best football is ahead of him. We had the Indiana game they played at IU, and I think he had 2 sacks. He definitely showed up big in that game. And I think you see some flashes as just a situational guy. And I think that'll continue to go. But, going back to your point about Mazi, I think Mazi played last year like 20 pounds less than he is now. So the fact that he's like 333 or 335 and he's playing 40 plus snaps and at a high level, you watch him, he plays hard. And that's not that common for, big dudes. So, yeah. I mean, for that, I think it's, I don't know what that is going to be worth in terms of first, second round, depending on the team. But I think that bodes well for whoever gets him, that they will get somebody who's going to work and is bringing intangibles to him in addition to, shocking strength and explosiveness.
So Bruce,
growing up in Ohio, sorry, real quick, it's living in Ohio, the Ohio State, Michigan is always the game of the year. I mean, but just from an evaluation perspective, I cannot wait to see these, that Michigan defensive line go against that Ohio State offensive line. I think Ohio State has the best tackle tandem in the country. I mean, Paris Johnson at left tackle has been great. 0 sacks, 0 penalties this year. DeJuan Jones have been blown away by at right tackle, how good he has developed, how much he has played compared to last year, how much better he has played. And he's still young. He's just turned 21 years old. I think it's an important factor with him. And then on the inside, Whippler at center, and they've got decent guard play. So seeing that Michigan defensive line go up against that Ohio State offensive line, which we know was such a factor last year when Michigan won that game. So seeing that this year is going to be, I think, the story of the game.
Yeah, well, we had the Penn State game, and Penn State has one really athletic tackle and one okay. The center is a good player. Now, I don't know, I know Ohio State really likes their center too, but that was a tough day for Penn State in the trenches. I mean, it was, especially Michigan's O-line just really wore them down. It was almost like Penn State broke. I'm not saying Ohio State's will, because when you see Jones in person, and he's just a massive man. He almost looks like he's in like a costume, that he's that big.
a giant human costume.
Yeah, I mean, seriously. Because before the game,
it's an 89-inch wingspan. It's just unheard of. It's crazy.
Yeah, before the game, I was by their offensive lineman at Penn State. And so I'm blanking on the left guard, who's not a small man either, but he's definitely not got the length of Paris, or, but you watched him kind of them fire each other up. And I was like, oh, Penn State's going to be in for a long day if this offensive line is going to play with this kind of intensity for 4 quarters. But you just look at how big the tackles are. And look, I don't know, Petit Ferrer was impressive athletically, but I feel like Paris is probably a notch above even that, right? In terms of what he's bringing. Yeah. And Petit Ferrer was what, a 5-star, Andy? I mean, he's from Europe.
Yeah, he was a Tampa guy. Yeah, he was a 5-star recruit and starting in the NFL right now. And I saw him starting on Sunday Night Football the other night. So I do a question for both of you, though. I don't know how much either of you got to see the Ohio State offensive line against Northwestern over the weekend. There were some absolute must get rundown plays where they got just jacked up by Northwestern D linemen. it did not look good. And it really worries me for them for the Michigan game, because it feels like Michigan is built to win in the trenches against Ohio State. And I as good and as athletic as Ohio State's offensive line is, I'm not sure we won't see something similar to what happened to them against Michigan last year.
Well, let me spin that a little bit to both of you. And Andy, being as an old offensive lineman yourself, I'm curious how you think of this and see it. But like, there's a feeling that Ohio State wants to go sideways more than it wants to go right at people. And I think people in the Big Ten talk about that enough, where I'm sure Ohio State's heard that. And at some point, there is going to be a challenge made to these big athletic people. I don't know if it's a switch you can turn on, a given week, but it would be interesting to see, because in person, Mayan Williams, it almost looks like this is probably not fair to him, but he almost looks like Ironhead's brother, who is at his son, Cam Hayward's brother, who's at, was Connor.
He played at Michigan State. Yeah.
Yeah. It was a really good all-around athlete.
Steelers, yeah.
Yeah. Really good all-around athlete, really good ball skills, but just did not he's almost like a bowling ball. And Mayan Williams looks like a bowling ball coming at you. He was a guy who, I think Ohio State beat Iowa State for, and maybe he's a 4.6 guy or coming out. Whereas Travion can roll, and you're seeing the wow highlights in some ways. And I think Travion's an awesome back, but I wonder if the mentality with Mayan Williams for that offense may be better suited to what Andy is hinting at or saying outright, which is like, you got to go out and
you got to push people around. Like, watch Michigan's offensive line. They push people around. Blake Corum has very good vision. Like, if the hole breaks open on a wide zone and it's outside and he has to go outside the hash, he'll do it. But he's also not afraid to just slam it right up in there. And they're not afraid to, just maul you at the point of attack, move the line of scrimmage back 3 or 4 yards. And Blake Corum is getting 3 yards before he's touched. I don't see that with Ohio State.
That's fair. I mean, because Mayan Williams, Blake Corum, I think, has arguably the best line of scrimmage vision in college football. He is so good at reading quickly and making his moves. Mayan Williams he's not a guy that will consistently string moves together. That's not his strength as a player. He's a guy you want rolling downhill, and he can shake guys along the way or go over them, but he doesn't have that start-stop coordination that Ohio State's, when they use him on some of those, stretches or outside runs. And credit to Northwestern, number 99, Adibare. He's a senior. He's an interesting prospect because he's got a unique body type, because he's like 6'1.5", 270, and they play him as
we all got unique body types, Dane. That's all of our problems.
Wait till you get older, Dane.
Yeah. They use him as a 3 technique, but he's a little bit of a tweener. But I mean, he was consistently making plays in the backfield, winning the point of attack, not allowing the guard to reach his outside shoulder, so he's shutting down these plays. He played his tail off, and so that tape alone, I think, is going to get him some more consideration. Teams going back to the tape and saying, maybe he's not a late round pick, maybe he's someone we consider a little bit earlier. But I think that your point is fair. We saw it in last year's game. Obviously, Michigan's defensive line, that was the strength where Ohio State
there's no Hutchinson or no Jabo, so I'm not as worried about CJ Stroud getting just destroyed. But I am worried about them not being able to run the ball when they need to, or use the run to set up the pass.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah. And I mean, it's fair to say that Trevion Henderson was out against Northwestern. Mayan Williams coming off an injury. So, I think that there were other factors going on there. But to your point, I think it's very valid that they could not just blow that Northwestern defensive line off the football and impose their will. So it'll be interesting. In that game, I do have to mention this too. When it comes to CJ Stroud, I've got a lot of tweets about how CJ Stroud couldn't throw it. Throw that game away. Throw the tape away for CJ Stroud.
Yeah, it does 38 mile an hour wind. You could be Dan Marino. You're not throwing in that.
No, I talked to a scout that was there, and there was no room in the press box. So he was on the field for that game. He said it was like nothing he's ever experienced. He said they had to have people by the pylons because they kept blowing over. They wouldn't stay up. that you couldn't tell which way the wind was going because the flags were all the way around the poles. So like it was just so he said that the game will not matter. It's something that for CJ Stroud's evaluate now for offensive line and for other positions, absolutely. But for the quarterback, it's a tape they won't even factor in.
I actually think it is somewhat helpful for CJ Stroud because when his team needed him to, he ran the ball very well. That's not something we expect from him. Yeah.
I mean,
by the way, I do want to point out, like, so our Adibare, he was a freaks list guy, and there are guys who you feel like it's like, I don't know if they look like the Colts old Robert Mathis kind of, where they're okay, how are we going to use this guy where he's 6'1"-ish, 280, like he was top 30 on our freaks list this year because, some crazy shuttle numbers and really, great agility. Like he's a guy athletically who could play on any team. It's just in that slop, and I feel like Northwestern's had some of these guys. Obviously, everybody knows about their offensive tackle, but it was. I think that's the kind of game watching it that Pat Fitzgerald loves. It's like, all right, we're going to play in soup. Let's see how good you guys are in soup. And
I kind of think Jim Harbaugh likes soup. Like he thinks chicken's a nervous bird, but non-chicken based soups, I think he's good with. So before we leave the Michigan topic, I do want to get your take, Bruce, and a little more from you, Dane, on Blake Corum, because we talk about him in college football in context of the Heisman Trophy and can he win it? But I'm curious about him as a draft prospect. We haven't talked about him all season as a draft prospect, and I'm curious where he falls.
Well, and I'll be interested in what you think, Bruce. But I know for me, he did not make my top 50, but the next day I did have an article saying with 15 players that just missed that I hated leaving out, and Corum was on that list. I hated leaving him out of there. Like I said, the line of scrimmage vision is so impressive. His decision making. We talk about decision making for quarterbacks, not enough in terms of talking about decision making for running backs. He's so good at the line of scrimmage, following his blocks, anticipating where those holes are going to be. Quick decision makers, and he runs so low to the ground that he's able to bounce off tacklers who are not wrapping him up. He's got the footwork so he can hit it without slowing down. His movements just have this energy that you feel like he's going to make something happen. And so for those reasons, even though I don't think he's going to have a great 40-yard dash, there are things you could poke holes in his game. But I still think that he's going to translate pretty well and be a guy that can be a nice part of a backfield.
I think this is a really interesting running back crop because typically you see it's loaded talent from like the SEC. But when I look at it, in the Big 12, obviously Bijan is a big back who can do everything. There's some wow in his game. Everybody raves about his character. Kendre Miller's blown up at TCU. He was actually in the same recruiting class there as Zach Evans, and the guys there really, you see the balance that jumps out. I don't know where he would get drafted, if he does come out. And then the other one in that league, and I don't know what he is in the NFL because of his dimensions, but I think he's an NFL player, with Deuce Vaughn. To me, Deuce Vaughn's the most exciting player in college football. And so you have those guys,
If only there was an undersized Kansas State back that
I know
had a good NFL career that we could compare him to.
And a long NFL career, no less.
Yeah.
Right? And so you have those guys. I like Corum because I just think getting in and out of the hole, I think a lot of that translates. Now, is he there's guys who kind of really pop in the NFL. You watch, I feel like a bunch of them played at Memphis recently, where you see Tony Pollard, some of the stuff he's doing with the Cowboys. I just think Blake Corum will be a guy who will be one of two somewhere, and he will put up really good numbers. And people go, yeah, I'm not surprised he's, doing well. I don't know if he would, a couple of years ago, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, kind of snuck in the end of the first round off a huge year at LSU to go to the Chiefs. I don't know if with Blake Corum, because they do a lot with Donovan Edwards in the pass game. So I wonder if some of that obscures, like Donovan Edwards could be a receiver for them. But then, some of the guys on the West Coast, I love Zach Charbonnet's game. He was at Michigan with them, and he's a bigger back. He's every bit of 220. He's gotten better as a receiver, and I think what you see with him is really good vision, and he's in a really interesting offense. And so there are guys out there. I don't know if outside of Bijan, I don't know if anyone would say, "Oh, yeah, that's going to be a first-round pick," because we know what the NFL thinks about running backs now, and it's just a weird place where if you had told me midway through last year who's like the most talented running back in college football, I would have said either Travion Henderson or Bijan. But certain guys have a hard time staying in a rhythm. And what I think in college, especially, and I think what we see is Blake Corum is a running back who just runs with a tremendous amount of confidence. And I would be surprised if he doesn't turn out to be a starting NFL running back at some point, because he's doing now.
It's funny you mentioned Memphis, because I actually wrote down a better version of Darrell Henderson as one of the comps that fits. So that makes total sense. I think when you look at this running backs, Bijan, obviously he's going to go early somewhere, probably top 20. But then Jahmyr Gibbs, to me, if he doesn't go in the first round, something's wrong. I know he's going to be about 205 pounds, but his feet are so impressive. Watching the LSU tape from the weekend, you just expect something big to happen every time he touches the football. I think him as a pass catcher is really impressive. Devin Achane from A&M is going to be really interesting, because we know he's going to run really, really well with his track background, and that speed is something you see on the football field. But he's listed at 185 pounds. How is that going to factor in? I think Zach Evans too, at Ole Miss, that's another one. So this is a really interesting running back class. You mentioned Charbonnet, who is, I think, in terms of, and you had a great story on this, Bruce, I think maybe even last year with Chip, and how he's just a great fit for that offense.
What he wants. Yeah,
exactly. And I think you see that with the vision, the patience. Now he's not the dynamic athlete that is going to get him drafted in a top 50, but in that 51 to 100 range, a team's going to get a really good back with Charbonnet. And then one other running back I wanted to mention, speaking of the Big 12, is Eric Gray at Oklahoma, the Tennessee transfer, who is now able to be the guy for the Sooners. He's doing a lot of good things, and there's some buzz for him among scouts as a guy that could go somewhere in the top 4 rounds.
Can I ask you guys to go back a little bit on Gibbs for a second? The guys who were had some, total wow players to me when I watched them in college, who weren't the biggest backs. Certainly one of them was Swift, who went, was at Georgia, and there was he just had a lot of juice in him, right? And, I know he's been at the Lions, and sometimes he flashes. I mean, is that is Jahmyr Gibbs a better version of that? I don't know. I'm asking.
I think Gibbs needs to go to an offense where they really like to throw to receivers or throw to backs out of the backfield. He's probably going to go too high in the draft for this, but what Jacksonville's figured out with Travis Etienne, as a compliment to him, would be tremendous. But I don't think Jacksonville is going to use that sort of draft capital, because you'd have to pick him probably in the second round or maybe the late first. So I don't think they're going to do that. But if you want an every down back who you can throw to, that's your guy. And you're not going to, pick in the top 10 and take Bijan. So I think that it just depends on how much you like to throw to your backs. Like what the Chiefs wanted to do with Clyde. I think it's very similar to Clyde coming out of college, because Clyde was really important to the 2019 LSU passing game. He was kind of the key to everything.
We're going to put all 5 guys out and go, good luck dealing with Clyde.
Yeah. I mean, and especially this year, because Alabama has no receivers who can separate, Gibbs is that much more important. And actually, I learned this, Michael Casagrande, who covers Alabama for AL.com, put this out on Sunday, and it blew my mind. The longest pass play this season for Alabama was Jace McClellan, the other back, taking a dump off 65 yards. That's the longest play all season.
Gibbs leads the team in receiving. He led the team in receiving on Saturday against LSU. I mean, he's a guy that the passing game is essential to what he does. I do think that the mini Alvin Kamara comparison, because Kamara is, a little bit bigger, but if you're talking about maybe a smaller version of that, I do think that fits with Gibbs.
Yeah, I mean, the people who had him at Georgia Tech thought he could win the Heisman at Alabama, and I don't think, as disappointing as that offense has been, you can't blame the quarterback and you can't blame him, right? I mean,
no, you blame the receivers because now Harold, the transfer from Louisville, got hurt, just started playing, so you've not gotten to see him do much. But like Jermaine Burton coming over from Georgia, I remember everybody who doesn't follow Georgia closely when that happened was like, "Oh my God, Alabama got Jermaine Burton," and all the people at Georgia were like, "Oh no, we lost Jermaine Burton. Oh, what are we gonna do?" And like, you've seen it. There is no Devontae Smith, no Jalen Waddle, no Jerry Jeudy, no Calvin Ridley, no Amari Cooper. There's nobody, and we've been so spoiled by that at Alabama the last few years. Like, it is jarring to see them unable to have explosive pass plays.
Dane, can I throw another running back name at you? I'm just curious what you think of him, just because he was a guy that, Pat Narduzzi told me about for a while. Izzy Abanikanda, he's been at times he's also productive. Like, I mean, he definitely looks like an NFL running back when you catch him on the, against maybe an average team in the ACC. He definitely seems like there's some wow to him too.
Yeah, no, there definitely is. And he's a guy that I think has put himself in a position where he's going to have an NFL decision to make after this year. But yeah, I think you take away, his 4 or 5 best games and you're thinking, okay, why can't this guy start at the next level with his ability to hit the hole? He's got a good mix of quickness, a little bit of power. I mean, he's got an all around type of game that you think will translate. So that's another good one. And I think we, just for the fact of the topic, mentioned Sean Tucker at Syracuse, what he could be at the next level, or
but he can't, like, if I'm not mistaken, he's only a second-year sophomore, right?
Right.
Sean Tucker.
Yeah, I thought he was.
No, he's a junior. He's draft eligible.
Oh,
yeah.
I thought he was a sophomore too.
He's a third-year guy.
All right. Well, there you go.
He's a third-year guy, so he's a guy we'll be talking about as if he declares, we'll be talking about him as someone that he did not make my top 50. I didn't really consider him that high, but in the 51 to 125 range, somewhere in there, he'll be, duking it out with guys like Corum and Eric Gray and Charbonnet and those guys. And I think,
maybe Chase Brown.
Chase Brown into the conversation. Exactly what I was about to say. What he's done this year, Chase Brown deserves to be mentioned. Coming into the year, Brown was viewed as maybe a late round pick, but what he's done out of the backfield catching the football, his ability.
He will test really well. He will test really well.
Yeah, right. And he's small, or he's short, but he's not exactly small. I mean, he's probably 5'9", 5'9.5", but he looks like he's, pretty well put together, 212, 215, which is good to see.
He's a little like Corum, actually, where they're just packed in there. It was shorter back. Maybe that's like I'm not saying they play like this, but kind of built like Emmitt Smith, maybe.
Right. And it was good to see Kenny McIntosh have a nice game against Tennessee. He's another one where I think the passing game is really going to factor into his evaluation. He's a really good pass catcher out of the backfield.
He's
James
Johnson Cook again.
Texas.
Yeah.
Well, but he actually has an NFL body. I mean, right. McIntosh, his brothers are defensive linemen, and he's kind of got a little bit of that. He's around 210, 212, so he looks more the part. Rashawn Johnson at Texas, he could be a 4th round pick, and he's a backup. But
that's the guy.
Special teams, everything, right?
That's the guy inside the Texas program that the coaches taught. Like, that's the alpha of everything. Like. I'd be shocked if he's not playing in the NFL for 10 years, because he's super strong. He runs well. He can do everything. And everybody talks about his character and his, mental and physical toughness. Like, I don't know where he goes in the draft, but I'd be surprised if, he could be the guy who the Patriots play at like 5 different positions on both sides of the ball.
Well, they got to decide if they're going to take DJ Johnson first. That's speaking of guys who play on both sides of the ball. But Dane, I wanted to get back to your 15 guys that you wished you could have put in your top 50, because there's one guy who I want to talk about, and he leads me to another discussion that you actually started on Twitter on Tuesday that I think is fascinating. Josh Downs at North Carolina, unstoppable against Virginia on Saturday. 15 catches, 166 yards, a touchdown. North Carolina needed every bit of that because, again, North Carolina's defense not that great. Their offense has to kind of do everything. They escape Charlottesville with a win. But Josh Downs as a prospect, won. And then on Tuesday, you bring up, if Drake Maye were draft eligible, he might be QB1 in this class. And as fate would have it, on the day that this podcast is dropping now, we're recording on Tuesday, so I don't know if this is going to definitely happen. But if the trains run on time, we will have Drake Maye on our show, on the Andy Staples show. And he's a guy I keep telling people, look at his stats, take the names away and put the stats up. Drake Maye would probably be your favorite for the Heisman.
Can we talk Josh Downs so we can get to this other discussion? Because I think it's really
bad. Yeah. Yeah, there's a little bit of both in there. But yes, let's talk Josh Downs first.
I mean, he doesn't, if you just walk down the street and you passed him, you wouldn't think anything of him, right? You know, he's not a big guy. He's listed, I think, at 5'10", 175 pounds. But watching him play, he plays so much bigger than that. And it doesn't matter what route you want him to run. It's a vertical route. It's a fade. It's, it's some type of crosser where it's a catch and go opportunity. He can do all of that. He tracks the ball really well. The ball doesn't hit the ground. I think he had 16 targets on Saturday. He caught 15 of them. There was just one that was just, was just slightly off. And so this is a guy that if you throw in his direction, good things happen, both with his ability to gain separation, but then also after the catch, he's tough, he's fast. So, I mean, Downs was a guy that I hated leaving off my top 50. And there's a good chance he probably makes it on the next update. He's a good player.
Who would be, Dane, right now, the 4 draft eligible receivers you would have 1 through 4, 1 through 5?
So I think at 1, I'm probably putting the TCU kid, Quentin Johnston, another one of your free guys.
Passes the eyeball test. He was 195 last. He was 215 now. You know, and he was banged up in our game. Like he rolled his ankle 2 weeks ago, played through it, and then beginning of the game, tweaked it. He was out the whole game. I would have been interested to see because Texas Tech actually has really big, long defensive backs. Mm-hmm. And I think they're guys who are 2024 draft guys, maybe. They're probably mid-round guys, but they're pretty good athletes. And I think they were going to try to press him. And how would he do against the press? I think that was a question mark that I think people there had. But I definitely get why he could be the first receiver to go.
Well, and he's a difficult evaluation, right, for what you just mentioned. And a lot of times these Big 12 receivers, you know, you're asking yourself the same questions. Like, what about when he has to face press? What about when he has to face better corners? That's something that you worry about with Quentin Johnston. But I think that Kansas tape really swayed some doubters. I mean, whether it's tracking the football, whether it seemed like he's making the first guy miss after every single catch. And it's not with just size. He's got some elusiveness to him as well. So right now he's the top guy, but it's fluid. Jordan Addison right after him. He's banged up right now, but we think he's back pretty soon, right, Bruce?
Yeah, I would be surprised if he's not playing at least next week for the UCLA game. Both he and Mario Williams, who's a really talented young receiver who transferred in from OU, another guy kind of from Andy's area. They both missed the last weeks. I suspect they will be back at, probably at the very least by the UCLA game.
Where does Jackson Smith and Jigba fall, Dane? Because he hasn't really been able to play all season. Yeah.
He's next. And look, I think that we've been so spoiled the last few years with receivers, Ja'Marr Chase being a top 5 pick. And then last year with Drake London and Olave and Garrett Wilson, and we had 6 receivers go in the top 25. So, this year it's just kind of assumed, okay, well, whoever's the top receiver, he's going top 10. And I think that's the disconnect with Jackson Smith and Jigba, where he's just not viewed that way by NFL scouts. They like him. Jackson Smith and Jigba is a really good player. They just don't view him as the same way they viewed Olave or Garrett Wilson. So Smith and Jigba, even though and it's been a bummer he's missed this season, I don't think it's necessarily hurt him from a draft evaluation. Although it is a little bit of a missed opportunity. Would have been nice to see him hopefully run some more routes on the outside because he's been really strictly an inside guy for that team. But I mean, CJ Stroud he's played with a lot of good receivers. He calls Jackson Smith-Njigba the best receiver route running wise that he's ever played with. And that says something. So Smith-Njigba, I think, is right there, right after those two. He's in that late first, early second round discussion. And then the next two guys, if I'm doing a top five, are really wild cards. That's Jalen Hyatt from Tennessee, who has really exploded this year. There's a lot of missing parts to his evaluation in terms of him as an underneath receiver, him running different branches of the route tree, but he has legit low 4.3 speed and he has trust in his hands. And those two things, I think are going to get him drafted pretty high. And then Kayshon Boutte from LSU, who, I mean, he's tough to figure out. He's probably a slot only. That's at least where he does most of his damage. And that's a little bit of a question mark. And he has the ability to be a really productive pro. It's just, is he going to get there? Is he going to, fully realize that potential? So he's a tough one to figure out. And so those would be top five. But even after that, Rashee Rice from SMU and Cedric Tillman from Tennessee, Josh Downs. I like A.T. Perry at Wake Forest. So it's even though I don't think we have a lock top 10 receiver this year, it's still a pretty good group.
If Jackson Smith-Njigba goes out, and this is not a knock on you at all, Dave. If he goes outside the top 25, he will be the steal of the draft.
He's going to be a long-time pro. There's no doubt, right? I mean, because his ability to get open, his ability to catch the football, he's got some juice after the catch. I mean, I agree. Especially if they use him in the right way and just let him be a slot receiver and just he'd be a guy. If I have a fantasy football draft, a PPR league, I'm looking to get Jackson Smith-Njigba. He's going to rack up those catches. I agree. It's been a bummer we haven't been able to see him this year. Hopefully, I don't know if this is going to be a Nick Bosa situation where just like, okay, at some point you got to shut it down and just start prepping for the draft, or if he's really going to push because hamstrings are one of those things where if you push it too early and you're going to do more damage, and so it's going to be interesting with him to see if we get to see him at all next few weeks.
All right, it's time to have the Drake Maye conversation because you said it, Dane, on Tuesday, and my eyes kind of popped because this is a soapbox I've been on for about a week about, hey, look, if you look at Drake Maye's stats compared to everybody else's, you'd have him in your Heisman conversation. And it's interesting because he actually plays for a team that still has a chance to make the playoff. This is not a case where a guy plays for a terrible team and is just putting up huge numbers. But, and this is a fair criticism, he's probably not playing as good at defenses as CJ Stroud or Hendon Hooker. I also think Jalen Carter should be considered for the Heisman, but that's just me. But let's talk Drake Maye and what you've seen out of him, because I realize he's not eligible for this year's draft, and there may be some people yelling at their device right now, like, no, talk about the guys this year. You may need a quarterback next year. So let's talk about Drake Maye.
And there's nothing more annoying. I know next year's quarterback class is so much better. We hear that almost every year. I get it. But I do think it was true last year, and I do think it could be true.
This year's is definitely better than last year's. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, but when you look at next year and you look at Drake Maye and Caleb Williams is legit, and I'll be eager to get Bruce's take on those guys too. But in fact, okay, does Anthony Richardson take a big step in his development? What does Quinn Ewers look like a year from now, with just more experience? So next year's quarterback class is pretty promising. But with Drake Maye, maybe it's the number 10 that's throwing me off, but he looks like Justin Herbert out there. It is tall, a little lanky, but a big time arm. He plays so natural, like everything, all the movements, the throws. He's not
an athlete. Remember his brother is Luke Maye, who didn't start North Carolina in football. He started North Carolina in basketball, which means pretty damn good basketball player. There's a lot of genes in this family. Dad played football at North Carolina. Drake Maye was originally committed to Alabama, flipped to Mac Brown, flipped into North Carolina. And he's one that I don't think the folks who listen to this feed who don't follow college football as closely, that's a name they might not have heard very much. You will hear that name a ton in the next few weeks and a lot next offseason.
Three quick things. First of all, it dawned on me as you said that, Andy, maybe the Twitter narrative of the quarterbacks that Mac Brown didn't recruit at Texas at North Carolina should be the quarterbacks that he flipped away from some big school, because he flipped obviously
Sam Howell
from Florida State and getting Drake Maye away. Those are program saving things for him at North Carolina. The second thing I would ask you guys, and I've seen more Justin Herbert in person than I've seen. The only time I think I've seen Drake Maye in person might have been at an Elite 11 workout, I think. But do you think there's as much juice in his arm? Like, Justin Herbert has an electric arm. I mean, is it that caliber? I'm asking. I don't know.
I'm not sure if it is.
Yeah, it might not be. I mean, because you're right. Herbert he's up there. And it might not be quite that, but I think it's close. I don't think it's that far off where he can make any throw he wants. And it could be a small window, an expiring window on the sideline. He's not afraid to make it, and he usually hits it. So I think it's fair to say maybe it's not quite there, but I do think it's pretty close.
Yeah, and the thing is, Justin Herbert has one of the 2 or 3 best arms in the sport. So there is that too.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. I would ask then the other part, and this was the part that kind of made my eyes bug a little bit. Like, wow, this is a statement, just because I was thinking, if he, and again, I'm asking, I'm not saying I believe this, but right now, if you're telling me there is a better NFL pro quarterback prospect in the 2024 class, I always have to feel like I'm thinking about what year
it feels like we should have jetpacks.
Yeah, the 2024 draft class than Caleb Williams, from what I've seen, from what I've heard from people there. Like, I don't know what he doesn't like. He moves exceptionally well. He's playing in a really good system. The ball jumps out of his hand. I mean, he's got pretty awesome stats too, in terms of like taking care of the football. He does things. Like, I think there's probably some stuff that if you drill down deeper, that people would be like, all right, I don't know how I feel about maybe this a little bit or whatever, but there is so much like stuff that's like jaw-dropping things that you see from him consistently.
Caleb Williams has kind of the Bryce Young qualities in terms of moving around in the pocket, except he's 6'1", 215. Yeah.
And also more explosive. I mean, both with his movements. And,
yeah. If he takes off, it's a different story. Yeah.
Well, and the way the ball explodes off his arm, it's just a little bit different than Bryce Young. And that's going to be the big knock on Bryce Young, is just the physical traits are not traditionally what you look for in a top 5 pick. But he's so special instinctively and with his vision and his poise that enough to overcome? Well, with Caleb Williams, you don't necessarily have to worry about some of those physical traits. And so I haven't studied enough of both those guys to say one's clearly better than the other. So if you told me that Drake Maye and Caleb Williams was in this draft, I wouldn't have said that, Drake Maye is the clear quarterback one, because, I think there's a debate there between those two guys. But among CJ Stroud, Bryce Young, Will Levis, I think Drake Maye talking about upside, talking about the traits, I do think that Drake Maye would be maybe not the clear-cut quarterback one, but I do think he'd be the top guy.
Well, and what's interesting about Drake Maye and Caleb Williams this season, both of them are having to make up for terrible defenses. And they're having, like, every touchdown they throw, their team needs, because their defenses stink.
Yeah. Well, and no, go ahead. Because that USC defense it's probably what's keeping them out of the playoff. Legitimately keeping them out of the playoff hunt, right?
Yeah, epically bad last year. It's gotten a little better because it's got at least a little bit of cohesiveness to it, but it's horrible. Now, the flip side is, if it was a 7-on-7 game, USC would be a huge problem for people, because the receivers led by Addison are really good. And I don't know, we didn't talk about him a couple of minutes ago about running backs, but Travis Dye has matured into be a really, really good college running back. And he runs hard, and he's very smart, and he takes care of the ball. Like, there were little concerns about that back in his Oregon days, and early in his Oregon days. And I just think he's a very good fit for what they do. But to me, like, if Caleb was in this draft, and I love Bryce Young, I am so impressed by what he does. And the only thing I would say about the dimensions and the physical, like people will say, oh, there's, try to compare his game to Russell Wilson. Russell Wilson's a big, thick, or a short, thick guy. I don't think.
Who also was a star baseball player, like very different athletic
It
profiles.
was almost like a scaled down Mahomes body, where he's just wide and everything, where that's not Bryce Young, but it's kind of encouraging. I'm not talking about like in the production that he's had, but like, Andy, you remember what Kyler Murray looked like when he got to A&M, and he wasn't particularly thick. He was a smaller, short guy too. He's not like, he's kind of filled out some. I don't think his
Kyler's a lot thicker than Bryce Young now.
He is, but maybe, but Bryce Young, maybe you're selling yourself to believe. Like, I think Bryce Young, if you can get past what he's going to weigh and worry about durability concerns, not toughness concerns, but just durability concerns of what he's going to hit. And I think he's smart enough and savvy enough to like, all right, I know where I got to make business decisions.
Can I tell you, I'm more worried about CJ Stroud taking hits than I am Bryce Young, because I worry more about CJ Stroud's pocket awareness. Like, he's going to get ear hold, and Bryce Young is never going to get ear hold.
That's interesting. I mean, this, before we let you out of here, Bruce, I do want to hear your thoughts on, these big three quarterbacks. You mentioned, just talk about Bryce Young, but CJ Stroud and Will Levis. I mean, along those lines, how do you look at these quarterbacks?
Going into the year, I thought CJ would have been, because he's physically bigger than Bryce Young by a lot. He's 225 pounds. Bryce Young, I don't know if Bryce Young is 195 pounds. Like, he doesn't look it. To me, Bryce Young plays quarterback better than those other guys. He sees the game, and I've had these conversations with Ohio State coaches and been around them when they've had them with, just because I'm on the field around some scouts. They rave about how smart and the intangibles for CJ Stroud in those conversations. They will go to bat for him in terms of what he brings intangibles wise. When you talk to some of the scouts, they will go to some practices and be like, they're not that fired up about his arm. Like, there are times where it's not he's accurate, and you want to see that, but I don't think there's like this guy like we're not talking, let's put Justin Herbert and Mahomes and those guys, not even that. Like, Joe Burrow didn't have an electric arm either. And he obviously led a team to a terrible franchise to a Super Bowl really fast. So does CJ have the command? Like, to me, Joe Burrow was so mature and like such a coach on the field, more so than any kid I've ever been around in college football.
Again, pocket awareness too. I think of Joe Burrow in that SEC championship game against Georgia, where Georgia was getting through, and Joe Burrow was just sidestepping, finding somebody, making stuff happen.
Joe Burrow was picking his teeth with SEC defensive players. Like, it was like, like he was going in there like he was playing at a game with like big people who couldn't operate. It's just like it was like unfair the way he kind of toyed with people at times. I do think that CJ, even without Jackson Smith and Jigba this year for most of the year, has way, way better talent around him to throw to, and honestly has a way better system to operate in as a quarterback than Bryce Young does, and certainly better than Will Levis. Like, and I'm not making excuses for Will Levis on this.
No, we can make the offensive line excuse for Will Levis. I'm perfectly willing to accept that.
There's a couple of things, Andy, though. Like, I don't know if I'm jumping on the table for Will Levis inadvertently here, but like, so Will Levis got to Kentucky after spring ball. He got an OC there who really knew what he was doing and believed in him, and Liam Cohen. Went really well as his 1 year there without a spring ball, hit the ground running, had an awesome year. And then Liam Cohen got a chance to be the Rams offense coordinator left. And now we got another system coming in. And even though it's maybe not radically different, it's a different feel. So it's basically the third system he's had to kind of absorb in a short amount of time. And it has had a lot of ups and downs. And so, I think if somehow the NFL personnel people can not fall too much in love with Will Levis's physical toughness, the horsepower in his arm and his athleticism, that if he can end up in the second round somehow, and go somewhere.
Oh, and you give me a redshirt year? Absolutely.
Doesn't have to play right away.
Yeah.
I think he would have, I think it would help him a lot more than, oh man, we got to ride him and he's going to be in a tough situation. And then all of a sudden, and I don't want to say he's this guy, because I think he has a much better arm than this, but like he goes in the top 10 and ends up like having a Sam Darnold kind of run where he looks jittery and he never looks comfortable. And then people worry about his accuracy and how well he sees it, because he's just thrown into like a really messy situation and he's not comfortable.
Well, I'll give you a comparison. Daniel Jones. This is a guy who checks all the athletic boxes, but didn't really drag his college offense to greatness. Like those Duke teams were okay. They played in bowl games, but they didn't play in good bowl games. And I think that's like, I'm looking at Levis's season this year. And the Kentucky game was just an abject disaster. He was bad in that game. His line was bad, and everything about that game was bad for Kentucky.
Tennessee game?
Tennessee.
The Tennessee game. I'm sorry, excuse me. But almost everything else, he's averaging 70% completions. He's in the 9s in yards per attempt in most games. Like, he's not doing that badly. He is trying to force some balls into windows he shouldn't. But a lot of times that's because he's got to make something happen because they can't do anything else. So I'm not as out on Will Levis as I thought I was. I still think there's some hope for him, but I'm with Bruce. Don't throw him into a situation where he's got to be Superman right away.
Is he poor man's Josh Allen?
Well, that's what people are going to point to.
That's the hope.
That's it. Yeah, exactly. They're going to see Josh Allen, how much he's developed. They're going to look at Will Levis and say, well, with our coaching, we can do that. And, it's especially once, say if Levis goes to the Senior Bowl, that's why Daniel Jones ended up in the top 10 is because of the Senior Bowl. If Will Levis goes to the Senior Bowl, I think he's going to look great. Obviously, throwing the ball in a practice setting like that, it's going to look really, really good. And I'll be shocked if he's just going to top 10, top 12 at that point, which, and that's a fair thing to point out. Perception, if you're drafted that high, there's a certain perception that will follow you your entire career.
Yeah, if Daniel Jones was a second-round pick, we'd be like, oh, he's kind of a bargain. He'd also be a free agent right now. Or would have been a free agent this past year.
Let him go to the Rams. I don't know if the Rams have any second-round picks at this point. Let him go to the Rams. He can reunite with Liam. They don't have to play him right away. And I don't know how long Stafford is. He may have to wait for 4 years for Stafford. I don't know. And NFL teams aren't waiting that long. But let him go somewhere where it is like what you said, a redshirt year, and there's somebody who really is going to buy into him, as opposed to like, Well,
and that's a situation. Like, I was watching Malik Willis the other night, and he makes a throw to the tight end down the seam, and I'm like, oh, there's that arm. There it is. But I said this all last year. Do not pick Malik Willis if you think you need to start him this year. And I don't think the Titans picked him in a spot where they thought, because obviously he's just replacing Ryan Tannehill because he's hurt. But I'm like, if Malik Willis gets enough time to develop, he might be a good NFL quarterback. Like, it's potentially with Levis, there's more tools to work with. So maybe, but don't throw him into a situation where you're going to wreck him right off the bat.
And somebody has a real detailed plan. Like, I think it's awesome what the Ravens do. Like, they have so much of a feel for a plan, an identity, and Lamar is an amazing fit for what they do. And even you should see, like, I don't know if this is the right term for granular, but you see how, like, one of my favorite players to watch, in the last 10 years was Tyler Huntley. He's as as tough as anybody. It's like, all right, he could go
perfect
in and
backup for Lamar Jackson.
Exactly. And there are some guys like that where you're like, okay, how would this fit if they just, maybe got him in the 5th round? And I'm not saying take Will Levis out of this for a second, but it's like, you have to have somebody who goes in and says, all right, this kind of player, we are really all in on. You can't just like, oh, he fell to us, and now we're going to try to fit him into a different way. And
I mean, that's kind of what Russell was with the Seahawks. And it just so happened that when he got there, he's better than Matt Flynn. But it was like, we like this guy. We think he could be the guy in the future. So we're going to take him in here in the 3rd round and see what happens.
Bruce, and I'm going to apologize because I'm going to put you on the spot here. but I did this to Andy 2 weeks ago. So, and I apologize if you heard this, but and I wrote about it in my outlier article. But there, in the last 25 years, there have only been, this is going back to Bryce Young, there's only 2 quarterbacks who have been drafted out of 300 quarterbacks that were both under 6 foot and under 200 pounds. So, and neither were drafted in the first 3 rounds. So Bryce Young, a complete outlier. Can you name who those 2 players were that were both under 6 foot and under 200 pounds to be drafted? And while you think about that, hearing you guys talk about that really brought up an interesting philosophical point when it comes to these quarterbacks is, when I talk to teams this summer about, we had one quarterback on the top 73 picks, we've never had that before and this and that. They all mentioned kind of the same thing that, well, we're looking towards next year's class. And you know what? We're not going to take the bait. We're not going to, because in past years, we would have seen Malik Willis go in the second round, Matt Corral go in the second round. But teams were more willing to be patient. And it makes you wonder, will teams picking in, say, the top 10 this year, whether it's the Lions, whether it's the Panthers, whoever it is, if they're looking towards next year's class and saying, hey, you know what? Because every team does this. Every team does advanced scouting. They're looking at next year's class and said, hey, we like CJ Stroud, but who we really like? These guys next year, will they be willing to be patient? So it's an interesting part of this quarterback evaluation that teams are going to be discussing amongst themselves when they start to stack this board and figure out if there's a quarterback for them in this draft.
Dane, they're going to probably talk themselves into patience to think, who I really like? And that's Drew Aller from Penn State.
The 2025 draft. Let's go.
Yeah, Drew Aller. And maybe Jimbo, don't screw up Connor Wegman. We like how those guys are wired and they throw it. Maybe. My guess is, and I don't know if they measure the 6 foot part. And you're saying the first 3 rounds?
No, it just in the draft. Neither of these 2 guys went in the first 3 rounds.
I think Bruce is going to get one of these. I don't know if he's going to.
So yeah,
I didn't get either one.
There have been 301 quarterbacks just drafted. Period. The last 25 years. These are the only 2 out of the 301 that were both under 6 foot, under 200 pounds. So one, you know both these guys. One had a decent career in the NFL. Lasted for a little while. The other one didn't play very long, but I think did okay in the AFL, Arena Football League.
Oh,
I was a while ago.
Yeah, so technically Johnny measured over 6 feet then, right?
Well, he was
Johnny's over 200 pounds.
He was under 6 foot, but he was 207, so he was just over.
He's had some collars in his pockets.
Kyler also over 200.
I'm going strictly by combine medical.
Wait,
so
Murray was conferences because I'm going to struggle. I have a hard time going back more than a couple of years.
There's a Big 12 quarterback turn of the century.
Yeah, drafted in 2003.
Was that Michael Bishop or Al Roberson? I thought they were both over 60 pounds.
The blast from the past names right there.
Another former Big 8 school, not that former Big 8 school.
Not Todd Reesing. He wouldn't have got drafted, right?
Nope. But you're right there. You're on. This is before Todd Reesing. Todd Reesing would have been like 09. But
played
not Chase
Seattle
Daniel.
Seahawks for a little while there.
Oh, what's his name from Iowa State, right?
Seneca Wallace.
Yep, you got it. I would have thought Seneca Wallace was like 6'1", though, because he was really.
This is what I said when Dane said that. I immediately started furiously looking up Seneca Wallace's draft profile because I was like,
under 6 feet. Wow,
he was that small.
At the combine, he was 5'11" and 3/8, 196 pounds. And then the other one was.
Wait. You know who I don't think he got drafted. Who was a player I loved in college, and he was definitely under 6 feet and under 200 pounds. Was Vernon Adams.
Yeah.
Canadian football legend Vernon Adams.
Yeah. The other one was Joe Hamilton, Georgia Tech back in the day. He was 5'10".
You know what's funny about this? So last week, sorry to jump in, but this is
of course Bruce has a Joe Hamilton story.
Yeah. So we are in Fort Worth. So they take our crew. This is the Davey O'Brien committee takes us to the Fort Worth Touchdown Club. And so there's like a wing of all the guys who won the Davey O'Brien Award. So we're walking in, and it's a lot of overlap from the Heisman. And I go in there and it's like, you see it, even though like Mike Singletary apparently won it twice, this was like we're just giving it to quarterbacks, whatever. So he's not even in there, like his bust or his thing. But we get to the point where I look and I'm like, so I see Joe Hamilton and I tell one of my colleagues, I was like, yeah, I went to the town. Like my second featured ESPN magazine was on Joe Hamilton because he's from a town that technically doesn't exist anymore. Alvin, South Carolina does not have a postal code. It's like, I don't know, 300 people. And there's a bunch. Courtney Brown was from there, who was obviously a first pick, and Pearson Prelu was a really good player. So it's like, has a lot of good football players, but not like, there was one business in the town. It was the barber shop, the weight room, the pool hall, and the fish fry place. It was all in the same place. It was across the dirt road from where Joe lived. And I thought, like, if Joe came along now, I would love to see what he would have a chance to do in the NFL, because he was a really special quarterback. But so a couple of rows over from Joe Hamilton, I see the Jason White stuff. And Jason White apparently won the Davey O'Brien twice. And I'm looking at it, and I'm in there with Leinart, Matt Leinart, and a couple of my colleagues from the show. And I'm like, maybe they have like a academic component to this, because Matt won everything, but he didn't win the Davey O'Brien. He was not too happy that I pointed out that he wouldn't make. He was looking at some of the other names in the room.
It's sort of like the Golden Globes to the Oscars.
Yeah. So, but yeah, Joe was a phenomenal college quarterback, and it makes sense. I should have got that one.
Yeah. Joe Hamilton and Reggie Ball, electric Georgia Tech quarterbacks.
Reggie had a little better talent to throw to.
That guy was okay. That tall guy.
Whatever happened to him?
He could run. Yeah. Well, guys, this has been amazing. We probably could do this for 4 hours, and we might actually when we're together at the Combine or one of those days. But Bruce, thank you so much for joining us.